So one of my favorite formats of filmmaking lately has been the mini doc, which is essentially just a documentary that is squished down into nothing more than, say, like 3 minutes. It's kind of equal parts challenging and exciting to try and get an entire story and all of the information that you want to get across into one small little bite-sized piece like this. So we just wrapped up a mini doc with Bree Masters for her collection with LSKD, and I wanted to run you guys through what the process was like from start to finish. So we'll start with storyboarding and then all the way through to export. Let's check it out.
I'm walking out into the stadium of 80,000 people. I look around and just take it all in, making sure that I've got enough mental pictures to remember this moment for a lifetime. I visualize my race in this moment. On your marks, I get into my blocks and take a few deep breaths. Set, I breathe in, go. I think my earliest memory of sport is in surf lifesaving. I started on the beach. I was 6 years old, and yeah, that's where it all started. I've learned so many life skills that I can take with me through whatever my next chapter is. I've learned how to be more confident. I've learned that I can achieve hard things if I put my mind to it, that nothing is impossible. Growing up, as much as I looked confident, I had a lot of self-doubt, and that's definitely a massive learning that has come in my athletic career. It's taken a lot of time, and I'd probably say that sometimes I do slip a little bit and still doubt myself to this day. And even at the Olympics, I walked away from the semi-final and I said, I'm just a beach sprinter. I don't belong here. I'm not meant to be here, but I need to believe that I do. And I worked very hard to be there. Setbacks are just a chapter in a much bigger story. As an athlete, I've had a fair share of setbacks, and every single one of them has just made me stronger. You either let it affect you and put you down, or you kind of grab hold of it and make something of it. I think that's where the real magic happens.
So there it is. This type of mini doc is designed to be very socials friendly. So it's designed to live on, Reels and TikTok. So shareable, watchable. It doesn't take too much time commitment, and it can just be easily watched locally on the platform. Now, being that it is on TikTok and on Instagram, this means it's competing with a lot of other stuff out there. So the first, 10 seconds, even 5 seconds needs to be very engaging and quick and snappy. So the way we overcame this was we designed the first 20 seconds to be very linear, very narrative driven and easy to follow. So it begins with what's called a cold start. Now, if you've ever seen an episode of a show like The Office, then you will know exactly what a cold start is. It's where you get dropped straight into the action without any prior context, any knowledge of what's going on, but it's super easy to follow, and it's just this almost mini story within the larger story itself. And that's exactly what we did with Bree here. Now, I drew from 2 references for this one. So the first one being one of my all-time favorite documentaries. It's called Holy Ghost. It's by a band called Architects from the UK. Now, if you haven't watched it, I would recommend checking it out 100%. It's been one of the biggest influences in my filmmaking career for a very long time now. Absolutely love it. Now, the reason I drew from this is because it starts with this crazy riser at the start. So the whole sort of first minute and a half is just this build up, right? Just before they walk out onto stage. It's just this riser that is just continuously building this kind of anticipation. And then it's just got this hard drop into a really quiet scene after that. Now, that's something that I really wanted to emulate with Bree here. I really liked the idea of it just hooks you in from the start with this thrilling kind of anticipation, and then it just builds up into this harsh cut and just drop into silence. Another thing that I loved about this documentary is after that really harsh riser and that drop off, it goes straight into these beautiful sunrise shots at the beach with their drummer Dan. And this was a perfect match for Bree because her athletic career actually started doing surf lifesaving and nippers, but I'll get onto that in a sec. Now, the second reference that I drew from here was a documentary by New Yorker about Sha'Carri Richardson. And there's this one section in there where she kind of gets into this hypnotic trance state, talking about the environment, the location of like a track day, and then she finishes with go. She finishes with the word go, and then it kind of kicks off into like the actual race. And I really liked that as being part of the introduction. You know, she's describing kind of like the environment and the feeling of a race day. So that was another thing that I wanted to emulate in this doco with Bree. All right, now let's get onto some pre-production. Now, I've spoken about Milanote before in the past, and I'm sure I'll keep on talking about it in the future because this app is unreal. Everything you can do in here from a pre-production perspective has just completely changed the way we do our pre-production. So let me walk you through the board for Bree's pre-production here. So you can see here, I've got it broken into sort of 3 distinct sections, and then I've got a little note up the top here with a couple of extra boards. But to begin with, this is kind of like your overall mood board. So on the left here, I've got some video references. Now these 2 here were the main ones that I drew from, and then these other 2 here, which are actually from Danny Gevirtz, another 2 that I really loved. We didn't draw as much inspiration from those as we did the other 2, but still like wicked documentaries, and still definitely recommend checking them out. Now this next section over here is just kind of like the general mood board. So this kind of contains all of the different elements that we anticipated using in Bree's documentary. Now, how I created this was basically pulling reference frames from, you know, some videos I've created with Bree in the past, some of my favorite videos, some documentaries, things like that to help build an overall look and feel of how this documentary is going to look. I also went onto Bree's Instagram and pulled out a bunch of different kind of like little videos, little snippets, things like that to help build out a really clear idea on, you know, what her kind of lifestyle looks like. And this will help me when we start to put a shot list together and, you know, a template together on what we need to shoot. This is where we can kind of get all that information, especially if we're trying to, you know, show Bree's life the way that it actually is. So a lot of that came directly from Bree's Instagram. Now from that, you can see that I've also got an elements section in the middle here. So I've got historic footage, interview, gym training, track training, sauna, morning routine, Pilates, race day footage, and beach. Now that all basically just came from doing a little bit of research, looking over Bree's Instagram and understanding what kind of a story we wanted to build out. So having that list of elements, and I'll touch on that later, but having that list of elements really helps break it down when we start to figure out what we need to shoot and what we need access to from like an archival footage perspective. On the right over here, we have the interview section. So this is a few different kind of reference frames on what we think her interview might look like. Now, I've taken a couple here from Danny Gevirtz's documentary with Sydney McLaughlin. There's a frame here from that New Yorker documentary with Shikari I was talking about. And then a couple in here as well from one of my favorite filmmakers at the moment, Chris Nicholas, and his team Coda Filmworks. They did a couple of pieces for Gymshark in the last couple of years with Ross Edgley, and their interview setups are so good. So that's where I drew a few of my kind of interview setup references from. Now, the next thing down here, you can see I've got my rough video flow. So in bold up here at the top and at the bottom, you can see this is kind of like my concrete bookend. Like this is, you know, I know I wanted it to start like this and I know I wanted it to end like this. And the middle was kind of like my guideline, a little bit open to interpretation depending on, you know, how her interview went. But the start here, so you can see I'm talking about, you know, Bree's talking through the play-by-play of what happens during a race, like what's going through her head, the environment, the crowd, things like that. And then the harsh cut to her in the water, talking about like her earliest memories of the sport. And then in the middle here, you can see I've got my interview questions. Now, given that this documentary is really only going to be like a minute and a half, you know, this is probably overkill, but it basically just means that you get so much good stuff that you just have a lot of good options and you know how to cut it down later. So I don't always ask all of these questions in an interview. You know, I'll have them there as a bit of a guideline, but more often than not, just writing them down in the first place kind of helps you put a bit of a framework in your mind of how you want the interview to go, but then you got to allow yourself to kind of be guided by the subject. So, you know, you ask some of these questions, but be open to letting them guide you a little bit and just having a bit of conversation, because if you are letting them just kind of guide you through, like, you know, you're listening to what they're saying and maybe they're opening up little bits and pieces that you could potentially open up a bit further, like they're dropping little gold nuggets in there that you can be like, oh, tell me a little bit more about that. Whereas, you know, if you're just sticking to what's on your interview list, you're potentially missing out on all of these gold nuggets that they're dropping that you could potentially expand on. Now, with some of these questions, what I did was I kind of knew the answers that I wanted and I designed the questions to create those answers. So for example, this one here, what's your earliest memory of sport and track? So, you know, when Bree is in the water there at the start after that harsh cut, I knew I wanted her to be reflecting on her early career, you know, because she's in the water, that's where her career started. So I wanted her to tell me a little bit about what it was like growing up, what it was like when she first started getting into the sport, things like that. And that's where we got some of those questions, because she's talking about her earliest memory of the sport. Then I wanted to hear a little bit more about like present day Bree, where she's at the moment, like how her career has progressed, any life lessons that she's learned, things like that. And that's where these questions came in. So how have you changed as your athletic career has progressed, and what has been some of your biggest life lessons? Now, again, I've just designed those questions around the answers that I knew that I wanted. Now, with these interviews, I almost always start with a really open-ended question. So for example, this one here, it was, give me a history of Bree. It's basically just kind of like a warming up question. It's not very often that I actually use the answers from these, but it's a really good opportunity to get a couple of things. So one, it'll help warm them up a little bit, get them kind of comfortable talking on camera, things like that. Two, it helps you set your audio levels. You know, so if you haven't properly set them before you started, this first question will help to set your audio levels when they're actually talking, rather than them just, you know, counting to 10, because there'll be different inflections in their voice. Maybe they'll laugh, things like that. Helps you set your kind of peaks for where your audio levels are going to be. And the last thing is, it gives me an idea of what the subject thinks are the most important parts of their life or their history. So if they're, you know, talking about their entire history growing up as a sport, any of the kind of like key moments that they drop in there are probably worth prodding on a little bit further. So, you know, if they talk about like when they're in high school and some things happened or they had an injury and you don't already have that on your notes, then you can be like, oh, okay, well, tell me a little bit more about that, because it's obviously important enough to drop it in as a key moment in your history, or you think so. So tell me a little bit more about that. So, you know, like I said, I don't actually often use the answers from that first question, but it's a really good warm-up one, and it does provide a lot of value to the interview outside of just getting a good answer. Now, zooming out on the mood board, I've also got this top column up here. So in pink over here, I've just got a couple of notes that are important for us to keep in mind for the production, whatever that might be. This board here, I've basically just got another board that Bree can access that I've asked her to upload certain things. So, you know, maybe there's some stuff that I found on her Instagram that I quite liked. I just put some notes in there saying like, hey, can you upload this? She has access to it. That's basically just a list for her use. The next thing is the shot list, and I'll get into that in a second, but that's where my entire shot list lives. And then the last thing is the shoot schedule. So if we dive into that, let's take a look. So remember I mentioned before the elements. Now the elements, I just pulled that straight out of the mood board. You can see I've got the entire list of things here. Now that has translated into my shoots, because obviously there is a little bit of stuff that I need to, you know, access, like whether it's, you know, historic or archive footage, things like that. So from the elements, we have shoots. So these are all the things that we need to shoot. From shoots, we go into schedule. So, you know, day one, you can see I managed to get all of these three things done on day one. Day two, this was the things that happened on day two. And then day three, this is everything that happened on day three. Now, all of these elements here come out of this shoot list. And then finally, this translates into the timeline. So I understand that these are the production dates, so 6th to 17th of Jan. Then we have this much time for post-production, and then this is when we're aiming for release. So this shoot schedule board is super handy to have, and we've started doing this for a lot of our productions moving forward, because it just helps keep all of this in its own separate little spot. It doesn't need to be pretty, it doesn't need a mood board, nothing like this. This is just all of the data, and it just lives in its own board there. All right, next is the shot list. Now, as I have kind of, you know, progressed in my filmmaking career a little bit, I've understood more and more the importance of shot lists. And, you know, I think there was once a time where you could very easily just go, yep, I'll just go in, I know what I need to shoot. Like, I know what I'm doing, I've done this before. But, you know, the more you practice this, the more I think you kind of understand, like, all of the magic tends to happen in pre-production. Like, if you've done a really good job of your pre-production, you should be able to get onto set and there's less pressure because so much of the work is already done. All of the notes have already been made. Your lists have already been made on, you know, what are the things that you need to tick off. There's nothing to try and remember, or you don't have to try and, you know, make up stuff on the day. You just take your laptop or your tablet to the shoot, and then you have your entire list. You don't need to worry about anything. It's all basically already done. It's also another good place to store your inspirations. So I mentioned in one of my previous videos, a site called Frameset. Now, Frameset is really good for, like, you know, finding cool reference frames. Like, you know, you can just type in whatever you want and basically it'll come up. It pulls from movies, music videos, productions, things like that. But it's also really good for finding inspo, because you'll find that if you find a cool frame, they actually link the original video and then you can go on to watch the original videos from there. And most of the time that's really cool stuff. So Frameset is another great place outside of, you know, Instagram that is awesome for finding inspiration. So you can see here as well, I've broken all of these up into different shoots. So you can see in track, this is the most extensive shot list because, you know, Bree is a track sprinter. And then within track, I've broken that down even further. So contemplative, I knew a lot of what Bree was going to be talking about is very introspective. So you want a lot of shots where she can just be kind of sitting down, thinking, and any kind of voiceover can really go over the top of that. Next, you've just got like environment shots here. Now, this is just like shots of the track, shots of the stairs, stadium, things like that. You don't always use these, but they are really handy to have, especially with these kind of like fast whipping shots. And I'll talk about that later, but these like fast whipping shots of just the track kind of moving through the frame, super handy to have when you're doing any kind of like transitions, anything like that. Then I've got her moving into her warm-up routine here. We've got the startup shots and then the running shots. And then you can see I've also got beach, home, gym, and Pilates in here as well. Now, again, the more work you put into your pre-production, the less guesswork there's going to be on the day. So just having these written down or having, you know, actual frames, references in there really helps speed things up on the day. Now, in general, the shooting style and the camera movements that we went with for this one, all very simple. A lot of it was very static and kind of like observatory. So we weren't throwing, you know, any crazy camera movements in there, no like orbits or anything like that. A lot of it was just kind of like documenting what was happening, as well as just a couple of simple camera movements. So just like pushes and trucks, and that's basically about it. We just kept it super simple for this one, and we let Bree do most of the storytelling here. Now, in terms of camera gear for this one, we had a few tricks up our sleeves. So we used the A7S, which is on camera there. We used the A7 IV for just a couple of like handful of shots. We had the FX6, we had the FX3. Now, in terms of lenses, we had a couple of 24-70s, like the one that's on there. We had this Helios 44-2 58mm. Now, I love this lens. It has so much character to it, probably because of how much mold is in there, but the amount of character that it just adds to the frame. It's got this really nice bloom in all of the highlights. Really beautiful for like documentary stuff. We also used this set of Blazar anamorphic lenses. Now I'm going to quickly throw one on the camera so you can see what it looks like. Now that is what an anamorphic lens looks like. So that's actually 33mm, and I just had the 24-70 set on 35mm. So it's the same focal length, but you can see I've got such a wider frame, and that is purely because of what the anamorphic lens does to the frame. It just stretches it and squeezes it and does all of the most amazing things that I don't quite understand, but it just adds this character to your films that really ups it and really gives it that, I guess, cinematic quality of footage. So the Blazar set here, I've got 33 on there. I've got the 50 here, and then I've also got the 100. Now, these 3 lenses got a massive workout for this project. It was kind of like my first project really using them for something like this. I tested them out and things like that and loved them and knew that we really wanted to use it for this one. So this was kind of like our first time actually using it on an entire project. And I think the result that you get out of these lenses, this set of lenses, paired with something like the Helios 44-2 is just unreal. So let me quickly switch back to the 24-70. Okay, so the next thing to talk about, and is probably one of the biggest kind of like make or break factors, is the interview. Now, a really good interview can help set you up with wicked foundations for a good storytelling piece, but if you flop in the interview, the chances are you're really not going to get anything. And the best interviews start with really good preparation. So the preparation here was like, you know, I've known Bree for quite a few years, so I kind of understand her story a little bit. I'm really familiar with who she is as a person, how she operates. So a lot of the questions kind of came very naturally here, but it all started with just wanting to understand a little bit more about her mindset, and mainly around some of her biggest lessons in her career so far. Like, a lot of this is around kind of growth, and we wanted to start with that kind of, you know, start really early days when she talks about like her first experience with athletics, surf lifesaving, things like that, and then talk about the growth that she's had in her career. So a lot of the things that we asked her were based around her career progression, how she's gotten to where she is today, her mindset, and things like that. Now, in terms of interviews, I like to try and keep my interview setups as minimal as possible. Like, the more that you can make it feel like for your subject just a chat or a conversation rather than a big sit down interview with lights and lots of cameras and big booms, things like that, I find that you tend to get a lot more comfortable with them. They tend to kind of open up a little bit more, the more minimal it is. Now, this isn't always going to be applicable. There are some instances where you really are going to have to go hard with your setup. But for a lot of things that I've worked on so far, I've found that the more minimal I keep a setup, the more comfortable they are. So all we did for this one was we just put a lapel on Bree, which is the same lapel that I'm wearing here. So this is basically just a lapel plugged straight into DJI mics. And this gives me really great audio quality once I pair it with a good software like the Adobe podcast software. Just a lapel into the mics, one camera, one tripod, no lights. I'm just sitting down on the track in front of her and we're just having a conversation. You know, that's where you get so many comfortable answers from your subject. Is, you know, the more comfortable you can feel them, the more they're going to open up. Now, as I said before, for audio, all I do is I just take my lapel, which is just a Sennheiser lapel, straight into the DJI mic. It's just the original one, the DJI Mic 1, and then I download the WAV files straight off there and upload them all into Adobe Podcast. Now, this really cleans up a lot of the audio, and then I have a little bit more processing that I do in Premiere. I know this isn't the most, you know, technically advanced way of doing voiceovers, but it's been working for me for a number of years, and I think it produces great results. Now, one of my biggest tips when it comes to interviews is, rather than constantly thinking about what your next question is, try and forget it and just really listen to what they're saying, you know, really just sit there and just try and have a conversation with them. The more you try and listen to what it is they're saying, the more you'll find that they can kind of open up little bits and pieces here and there that you can kind of dive into a little bit deeper. Like, there might be some topics in there that you hadn't even accounted for. And potentially that's where some of these documentaries can take a bit of a turn, is you had planned for one thing, but they just kind of open up in a whole different subject matter and it leads you down an entirely different path. So that would be my biggest tip for doing any kind of interviews, is just listening. You know, really just listening to what they have to say. Think about, you know, potential avenues on what you can talk about, how you can open up a little bit more. But that doesn't happen every question. You know, like, you will find that some questions, they just provide a really good answer and it's like, great, cool, on to the next one. So it's good to have a list handy, but don't be constantly thinking about your next question. Just make sure that you are really listening to what it is that they're saying. So that's pretty much everything for production. Now, Dan and I shot this across 3 days. We've worked with Bree before, so it was really laid back, really chill. She's super easy to work with. So always makes for great footage anytime you work with someone that you're really comfortable with. Now, next, let's get stuck into post-production. Okay, so when it comes to post-production, once everything is imported, you've linked all your proxies, everything's ready to go, the first thing I do is get into selects. Now, if you don't know what selects are, selects is basically where you go through all of your footage from all of your shoots and you pick out any little usable sections and put them straight into one timeline. So this is good for two reasons. One, it helps you refamiliarize yourself with everything that you shot over those few days or however many days. And then two, it also helps you cut out all of the fat, right? So it basically puts all of the good stuff into one timeline so you can scrub through and know that everything you've put in there is all usable. And then once you have those clips, you can then go through and refine them even further and then even further again until you have basically just like the best of the best. So looking here, going through my timeline, you can see I've got all of my different sections grouped out here just with titles over the top of each of them. And I've also color coded each of these so that I know that each of them is from a different camera. So for example, I know that all of the orange stuff was shot on the FX3, all of the pink stuff was shot on the FX6, and then all of the green stuff here was all shot on the A7S. Now, as I'm going through, you can basically see that everything in here is essentially just like a usable clip. So that doesn't mean that all of this stuff will get used, but all of this in here is like a potential usable clip. So this is all of the stuff that I think has potential to be used in the final product. And you can see going through this timeline that I bumped any of the stuff that I really like up one layer. So what I'll do is once I've kind of gone through and done all of my selects, I'll go back through my selects timeline and scrub through, and then any clips that I really like, I'll bump them up one layer so that I know that everything that is on this layer on V2 is essentially good to go, is ready to be used in the final product. Now, the next thing that is basically going to help create the foundations of your documentary is your interview. So what I'll do is I'll sync up all of my cameras and all of my audio, depending on how many tracks there are, into one timeline. I'll scrub through the entire thing and I'll cut them into sections by using these markers here. So each of these markers I've given a different title so that I know at a glance exactly which section is which. And then I've just gone through and then spaced them all out so that I can easily navigate either in the timeline here or in my markers tab up here when I go through them in a bit of a list. Now, this is probably a little bit more useful when you have really long interviews, like anything kind of over an hour, you can just start to search for stuff in here. But in this one, because it was only a reasonably short interview for only a 1.5 minute long video, it's pretty easy to just go through in the timeline. Now, as I said, I've got all of these titled, so that makes it so much easier to go through after the fact and understand which section is which without having to go back through and listen to it again. So what I'll do, once I've marked every single section, I'll then duplicate that timeline into another one here, which is where I will start to cut out some of the sections that I don't think I'll use. Now, in longer interviews, I can find that I end up with like 8 of these timelines just stacked because I'll just keep on going through and just filtering out all of the stuff that I don't think I'll use. Now, the reason I do that instead of just deleting it all from the first timeline is that sometimes what can happen is you get into the final edit and you have maybe not quite enough. If you then have to go back to the timeline and you find that all you've left is the stuff that you thought was really good, it means that you're then going to have to go back, resync all of your footage again, scrub through and find some stuff that might work. So if you just keep on basically filtering it out one track at a time or one timeline at a time, then it's going to help keep all of the stuff there that you probably won't end up going back to, but it's just there in case. What I'll do from here, once I've kind of filtered my timelines down further and kind of refined them a little bit further into the best stuff, is I'll just marker some of the stuff that I think really has potential. So you can see I've got 4 sections here, all marked in red. You can change the colors to whatever you want, but I've got all of my markers in red, which basically lets me know like these ones here are pretty much the best of the best. Now, once I've got my interview cut up and I've got a few sections that I really like, I'll then switch over to finding music. And that is probably one of my favorite parts of the entire process. So I've been using Lens Distortions for a while now, and I find that their music, especially when it comes to like narrative driven storytelling type stuff, is just on another level. Like it is unmatched to anything else that I've used out there. I've used a lot of other platforms and I still find that Lens Distortions is the best. So for this one, I used their Tenfold album. Now this Tenfold album is like specifically designed for kind of storytelling. And when I got into this, the entire album hadn't even been released yet. It was just this first single, Strive, that had been released. And I just hit play and I just heard within the first few seconds, like I immediately know that this is exactly what I'm going to use because the intro is just perfect. Just have a listen to this. Like I could just hear Bree's voice over the top of this as she's talking because it just has this great little crescendo that just comes right in here. And it just has that hard cut. I was like, this is exactly what I want. Straight away, I knew 100% this is exactly what I was going to use. So definitely recommend checking out Lens Distortions. They've got a bunch of other albums in there and then they've also got sound effects. Now I use pretty much exclusively Lens Distortions sound effects for this entire project as well as music. So it's pretty much just driven the entire project, which I love. So once I've got my track picked out and cut up to pretty much meet the length of the project that I wanted, I then went in and added in all of the voiceover parts and all of the like actual on-camera stuff that I thought I might use. Now, when cutting this up, I usually try and cut out any of the little bits and pieces in between where there's like breaths or maybe there's something happening in the background. Now, often Adobe Podcast does a pretty good job of cleaning up all of this footage. So this isn't super necessary, but it just helps in future in case there's any like little blips or anything you didn't notice on the first take. So you can see all I've got here is basically just my track. I've got the interview and then I've got the voiceover from the start where Bree talks about walking out onto the track. The next stage here is I start to include some overlay footage. So you can see in this overlay footage here, I've got some gaps in between the footage. And I knew this was basically where I wanted to include some of that like black and white archival, those like pulses of like archival footage. They're gonna go in all of those gaps there. And then I've got pretty much all of the rest of the stuff that we shot over those couple of days. So more or less, this is a pretty concrete version of what all of the overlay is going to look like in the end, right up until Bree crossing the finish line, holding on that number 2 there, just as she comes across the line. Now, the next step was adding in all of the archival stuff. So what I've done here is I've taken all of the archival stuff that Bree sent me from the Olympics, from track days, from stuff when she was a kid. I've basically taken all of that and put it all into these little sections here. And what I've also got is to kind of help break this stuff apart from the present day footage is I've just got a black and white adjustment layer over the top here with a big S-curve to kind of really crush the blacks and punch out the whites. And then I've got this just cool like CRT effect that just sits over the top of it to help kind of bring that archival look and feel back to it. And then the next thing was I added in all of the stuff of her as a kid. Now, we're super lucky with Bree in that her dad filmed so much of this stuff on his like handy cam when she was growing up. So there's so much great archival footage of Bree when she was a kid, which was just like a filmmaker's dream. Now, the next step, once my kind of timeline is more or less pretty concrete, like how I think it's going to go for the final edit, is I start to bring in some sound effects, right? So there's a few ways you can do this. In some of my stuff that is really sound effects heavy, like there's no voiceover, no music, it's just sound effects, I'll usually do it in layers. But in this one, I kind of went through and did it all at once, just went through kind of laterally across the entire timeline. So starting with this section here, because this was going to be the most kind of sound effect heavy section in the entire production. Let's just have a quick listen through to this.
I'm walking out into the stadium of 80,000 people. I look around and just take it all in, making sure that I've got enough mental pictures to remember this moment for a lifetime. I visualize my race in this moment. On your marks. I get into my blocks and take a few deep breaths. Set. I breathe in. go.
So you can hear how sound effects heavy that is there. All of these like little crunches and ratchets, very mechanical sounding. Now, a lot of that I pulled out of a few of these albums here, mainly this Whiplash album, which is actually kind of like a, you know, automotive sound design album. It's made for like any kind of like car automotive videos, but I find that a lot of the sound design tracks in there have a lot of these really great little blips that you can just cut out of the track, and it just creates these really cool sound effects for transitions and things like that. Another great one is this Fast Cuts album. This is probably kind of like the first one that I used from Lens Distortions that was like, okay, whoa, this is like seriously, seriously good. And then Interval as well. Now, I don't think this one was actually released at the time of making this documentary. I've since used this in a bunch of other projects, but like these three here are pretty much like my favorite from Lens Distortions. I would check them out, especially if you're looking at like really cool sound design. These three are pretty much the goats. Now, after that first section, the sound effects kind of drop off a little bit just to make way for Bree's voice a little bit more. And they start to build up again in kind of like the back half of the track as the action really starts to ramp up. So I've got things like little clicks in here and then some whooshes over here. And then you can see towards the back end of the track here is where they really start to build up, like as we have this mashup of action here.
You know, you either let it affect you and put you down, or you kind of grab hold of it and make something of it. I think that's where the real magic happens.
So you can see that towards the back end there, as what she's talking about starts to ramp up in energy, as the track starts to ramp up in energy, all of the footage starts to ramp up. I've got the sound effects doing the same. So the sound effects just really bring a whole nother layer of energy. You're building this kind of crescendo right into the hard cut at the very end of the video. And then after that, basically the last thing left to do is color grading. Now, I'm certainly no colorist. I've just found something that I think really works for me. So you can see once I open up basic correction here, I've got this kind of like conversion LUT from S-Log3. Now this is from Phantom LUTs, and I managed to find this LUT pack that is kind of like an ARRI emulation. So rather than just taking it from S-Log3 to Rec 709, this Phantom LUT pack, and it is designed specifically for S-Log3, takes it from log to kind of like an ARRI Rec 709, and it is absolutely gorgeous. So I will link that LUT pack down below. And then from a creative perspective, I've just got the Danny Gewirtz LUTs. Now, these Danny LUTs are unreal. I find that the two that I use the most is this blue and orange one and the forest one. Generally no higher than like 35 or 40%, because that's when it starts to add in kind of like a bit of a tint into a lot of the colors, or it changes the hues too much. But that combination of those two is pretty much done. Like after that, what I'll do is I'll go through all of the clips individually, adjust any kind of exposure, adjust any kind of temperature, anything like that. I'll just go through the entire timeline and fix up any of those clips to make sure that all of the colors are on point. And after that, it's basically done. Like, it's the most simple color grading process in the world. Sorry, there's no more crazy secrets to it. It's basically just those two LUTs together. And then the last thing that I did was just added in these color mats over the top. So it's basically just, I think like 12% from top and bottom. Now, the reason I added those is because you've got all of this anamorphic footage that is cropped in, then combining it with all of the stuff that we just shot on the 16 to 35, which is in 16:9. If you go transitioning between like full 16:9 shots into like a kind of, you know, crop shot on the anamorphic lenses, it doesn't blend really nicely. So we basically just matched the crop of the anamorphic lenses all of the way through. Now, one thing that I did forget to talk about is how I do my voiceover. So I told you guys that I use the Adobe Podcast site. So I basically just upload the entire WAV file to the Adobe Podcast, and then I'll duplicate it. So I'll have the Adobe Podcast version, and then I'll have the original version directly underneath. What I do is essentially I just highlight all of those, and then I've just got an audio preset that I created here. So I just drag my audio preset onto those. Now in my audio preset, I've got dynamics processing, multi-band compressor, and parametric equalizer in there. And all three of those I find bring your voice to a really natural but really kind of warm and bassy level. Now you can either go through and do them that way, or one thing that also works really well is in this audio tab, if you highlight your audio clips, once you've got everything done, I just go create them as dialogue and then either go enhance speech, which is pretty much what the Adobe podcast site does. So there's no point doubling up on that. Or you go preset, and then I find the balanced low tone voice works a lot better on pretty much everything, whether it's like a female voice or a male voice, whatever. I just use balanced low tone voice on everything. That gives it, as I was saying before, this really kind of nice, warm, real bassy tone to it and keeps it quite natural, like it's not over the top processed. So those are the two different ways you can do it. Both sound really good. Both are great for a production like this. Once that's done, all it's basically left to do is exporting. So this was delivered in two formats. So in 9x16 for socials and then also 16:9. Now, when it comes to exporting, this is what my settings look like. So starting in here, my format is usually just H.264. All of this generally stays the same unless I'm delivering in 1080p. Now it's this section under more that makes all the difference in the world. So the first thing, render at maximum depth, make sure that box is ticked. Use maximum render quality, tick that one as well. Everything else down here stays the same. And then this next setting here, VBR 2 pass, this is where a lot of the magic happens, right? So you have three options here. CBR, which is continuous or constant bitrate, VBR 1 pass and VBR 2 pass. Now, the difference between 1 pass and 2 pass is where all the magic happens. So generally I will go 15 to 25. So 15 is your target bitrate and 25 is like the maximum bitrate that you'll let it go to. So say for example, you have a second of footage, you've told Premiere to export it at 15 megabytes a second, but maybe there's a bit too much color or a bit too much information in that shot. It can't quite get it to 15 megabytes a second. You then give it the ability to go over if it needs to. So here I've got 25, probably not really necessary. You won't find that there's much footage that there's a 10 megabyte a second difference, but it's good to give Premiere the ability to make that decision. And then the last thing is the LUT that I apply here. So essentially what happens when you export from Premiere, it seems to take a lot of the contrast out. So I've just got this QT gamma compensation LUT that basically reverses the effects of that. So Premiere sucks out the contrast, the LUT adds it back in. So you're pretty much back to what you were looking at in your source window in Premiere. So that's it. That's the whole production. Like I said at the start, this kind of like mini doc that, like 1.5 to 3 minutes is really quickly becoming like one of my favorite sort of ways of filmmaking at the moment. I love telling stories, and this format is a really good, really challenging way to try and tell an entire story in such a short time frame. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, please feel free to, send me a message or send me an email, anything like that. Now, one thing I didn't talk about at the start is my filmmaking course is now officially live. Cinematic Social is ready to go. It's live on my website. Be sure to go and check it out. It's basically an in-depth breakdown of every part of my filmmaking process from start to finish all the way through. Now, what you've seen here today is pretty much just a bit of a taste of what happens in the entire course. So cinematicsocial.co, go and check it out. If you have any questions, please reach out. If you have any feedback, I'd love to hear it. But for the time being, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. See you next time.